My wife turned every conversation into a war until I finally chose silence and planned the final talk that ended our marriage forever, unstoppably. My wife had turned every single conversation we had into an argument. Not some conversations, not most conversations, every single one. It started innocently enough. I'd come home from work and mention the weather. Pretty nice day outside, I'd say, just trying to make normal conversation. Without missing a beat, she'd fire back, "Actually, it's too humid. You never pay attention to how uncomfortable it really is." I thought maybe she was just having a bad day. We all have those, right? But then it happened again the next day, and the day after that. Soon, I couldn't comment on anything without getting corrected, contradicted, or challenged. The food I cooked? It's okay, but you always use too much salt. The movie we watched? That wasn't even entertaining. Your taste in films is questionable. Even when I complimented her cooking, she'd respond, "You say that about everything. You don't really mean it." At first, I told myself she was going through something. Stress from work, maybe hormonal changes, or just general life pressure. I tried being more understanding, more patient. I chose my words carefully, avoided sensitive topics, and walked on eggshells around our house. But it didn't matter what I said or how I said it. She found fault with everything. I mentioned that traffic was heavy on my way home. It wasn't that bad when I drove through there. You just don't plan your route properly. I commented that the grocery store was busy. You went at the wrong time. Poor planning on your part. The conversations became so predictable that I started anticipating her responses. If I said something was good, she'd find what was wrong with it. If I said something was bad, she'd argue it wasn't that terrible. If I tried to stay neutral, she'd push me to take a stance just so she could disagree with it. It was exhausting. Every interaction felt like a debate I never signed up for. I found myself avoiding conversation altogether, which only made things worse because then she'd accuse me of being distant and uncommunicative. One evening, I decided to test my theory. I kept a mental note of every exchange we had. The results were disturbing. When I said the weather was nice, she argued it was too hot. When I mentioned liking a song on the radio, she said it was overplayed and annoying. When I suggested we order pizza for dinner, she insisted we'd had pizza too recently, even though it had been over 2 weeks. But the breaking point came when I made the most innocent observation possible. I looked out the window and said, "The sky looks really blue today." Her response, "It's more of a cyan color. You don't really observe things accurately." I stood there staring at her, wondering when my wife had become someone who would argue about the color of the sky. This wasn't the woman I married. The woman I married used to enjoy conversations, used to find common ground, used to actually agree with me sometimes. That night, lying in bed, I realized we hadn't had a single peaceful conversation in months. Not one exchange where she simply listened, acknowledged what I said, or, heaven forbid, agreed with something I observed. Every comment became a correction, every opinion became a debate, every attempt at normal human interaction became a battle I was destined to lose, not because I was wrong, but because she was determined to prove I was wrong about everything. I started paying closer attention to how she interacted with other people. With her friends, she was pleasant and agreeable. With her family, she was sweet and accommodating. With our daughter, she was patient and understanding. But with me, everything I said was somehow incorrect, poorly thought out, or inadequately expressed. The realization hit me like a truck. She wasn't going through a phase. She wasn't stressed or overwhelmed. She had specifically chosen to turn every conversation with me into a conflict. I had become her personal verbal punching bag, the one person in her life who couldn't say anything right. I wondered how long this had been building. Had I been so focused on keeping the peace that I'd missed the signs? Had I been so eager to avoid conflict that I'd actually enabled this behavior? The answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I finally saw the pattern clearly. My wife had declared war on every word that came out of my mouth, and I had been fighting a battle I didn't even know I was in. As I lay there that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew something had to change. I couldn't live the rest of my life having every conversation turned into an argument. I couldn't continue walking on eggshells in my own home, afraid to speak because I knew whatever I said would be wrong. The woman sleeping next to me had made it clear that nothing I said would ever be acceptable. She had turned our marriage into a constant debate where I was always the losing side. That was the night I stopped trying to fix our conversations and started planning how to end them permanently. The next week, I decided to conduct an experiment. I wanted to see just how far this compulsion to argue would go. Would she really contradict absolutely everything? Or was I being overly sensitive? Monday morning, I tested the waters with the most basic statement possible. Water is wet, I said while filling my coffee cup. Without even looking up from her phone, she responded, "Actually, that's a common misconception. Water itself isn't wet. Water makes other things wet, but the water molecules themselves don't experience wetness." I stood there holding my coffee, staring at her. She had just turned a simple observation about water into a philosophical debate about the nature of wetness. This wasn't normal disagreement anymore. This was pathological. Tuesday, I tried something even more obvious. Looking out the kitchen window, I said, "The grass is green." Her response came instantly. "It's more of a lime green in some areas, darker in others. You're generalizing. Plus, with the dry weather, most of it is actually yellow-brown." I walked outside and looked at our lawn. It was green, perfectly, obviously green. But apparently even stating basic facts about color was now grounds for correction. Wednesday brought the most ridiculous exchange yet. I mentioned that our daughter had been born on a Tuesday. It was actually a Wednesday. She shot back with complete confidence. I pulled out my phone and showed her the birth certificate. Tuesday, clear as day. Her response, "Well, technically, if you consider the time zone difference from where your parents live, it would have been Wednesday there." My daughter was born in the same city where we currently lived. There was no time zone difference to consider. She was literally arguing against documented facts rather than admit she was wrong about something. By Thursday, I realized she wasn't just disagreeing with my opinions. She was contradicting reality itself, if it meant she could be right and I could be wrong. The breaking point came Friday evening. We were sitting on the couch, and I said the three words that should never cause an argument in any healthy relationship: "I love you." Her response still haunts me. Love is just a chemical reaction in your brain. It's not a real emotion, just dopamine and oxytocin. You're confusing biological processes with actual feelings. I sat there in complete silence. My wife had just argued against my expression of love for her. She had turned the most basic, fundamental statement of affection into a science lesson designed to diminish its meaning. That weekend, I started documenting every conversation we had, not writing it down, just keeping careful mental notes. The results were disturbing. Saturday morning, I mentioned the coffee smelled good. She told me I was probably confusing the smell with the vanilla candle she had lit. There was no vanilla candle. Saturday afternoon, I said our neighbor's new car looked nice. She informed me it was actually a lease, not a purchase, and that I couldn't possibly know if it was nice without test driving it myself. Saturday evening, I commented that dinner tasted great. She responded that I was probably just hungry and would think anything tasted good at that point. Sunday was worse. Every single interaction followed the same pattern. I would make an observation, and she would find a way to prove me wrong, correct my perception, or minimize my statement. When I said the church service was inspiring, she told me I was easily impressed. When I mentioned that our daughter played well at her soccer game, she pointed out all the mistakes I had apparently missed. When I said I was tired after mowing the lawn, she informed me that I wouldn't be tired if I exercised more regularly. By Sunday night, I had counted 17 separate conversations. 17 times I had attempted normal human interaction with my wife, and 17 times she had turned it into a correction, argument, or contradiction. The most disturbing part wasn't just that she disagreed with everything. It was how automatic it had become. She wasn't even thinking about it anymore. The moment words left my mouth, her brain immediately shifted into opposition mode. I tested this theory Monday morning. I said, "Good morning." Her response, "It's actually a pretty mediocre morning. The weather isn't great and I didn't sleep well." I had been corrected for saying good morning. She had found a way to argue against a greeting. That evening, I tried a different approach. Instead of making statements, I asked questions. "How was your day?" "Why are you asking? You never really listen to the answer anyway." "What do you want for dinner?" "You're just going to suggest the same three things you always do." "Do you want to watch a movie?" "You'll just pick something I don't want to see." She was now arguing against my questions before I even finished asking. She was anticipating disagreement and creating conflict where none existed. The final test came that Wednesday. I said nothing, absolutely nothing. I came home from work, kissed her on the cheek, and went about my evening routine in complete silence. Her response, "You're being passive-aggressive. If you have something to say, just say it instead of sulking around the house." I couldn't win. Speaking led to arguments. Not speaking led to accusations. She had created a system where any response I gave would be wrong. That night, I realized I was living with someone who had made it her mission to oppose everything I said, did, or didn't do. She had turned our marriage into a constant battle where I was always the enemy, always the one who was wrong, always the one who needed to be corrected. The woman I married used to laugh at my jokes. Now she analyzed why they weren't funny. She used to appreciate my observations. Now she corrected my perceptions. She used to enjoy our conversations. Now she treated every word I spoke as an opportunity to prove me wrong. I had spent months trying to figure out what I was doing wrong, how I could communicate better, what I could change about myself to fix our interactions. But the problem wasn't me. The problem was that she had decided everything I said would be wrong before I even said it. She had turned our relationship into a debate where she was the judge, jury, and opposing counsel all at once. That night, I made a decision. I was done trying to have conversations with someone who had made it clear that nothing I said would ever be acceptable. I was done being corrected, contradicted, and argued with every time I opened my mouth. The experiment was over. I had my answer. She would argue with anything and everything I said, no matter how innocent, obvious, or loving it might be. Now, I needed to decide what to do with that information. The moment that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening. I had just finished helping our daughter with her homework and was feeling genuinely happy about our time together. I walked into the kitchen where my wife was preparing dinner. "Our daughter is so smart," I said, smiling. "She figured out that math problem so quickly." Her response was immediate and crushing. "She's not that advanced. The homework is designed for her grade level. You're setting unrealistic expectations by praising normal performance." I stood there watching her chop vegetables, and something clicked in my brain. She had just criticized me for being proud of our child. She had found a way to turn a father's love and pride into a parenting mistake. That's when the full scope of what was happening hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about disagreeing with my opinions or correcting my observations. She was systematically attacking every positive emotion I expressed. Every moment of joy, pride, love, or satisfaction I tried to share was immediately shot down, minimized, or twisted into evidence of my inadequacy. I started thinking back through recent conversations with this new perspective, and the pattern became crystal clear. When I expressed love, she explained why love wasn't real. When I showed pride in our daughter, she pointed out why my standards were wrong. When I mentioned enjoying something, she found reasons why my enjoyment was misplaced. When I tried to share good news, she explained why it wasn't actually good. She wasn't just arguing with my words, she was at war with my happiness. The next morning, I woke up and said, "I slept really well last night." Her response, "You were tossing and turning. You probably think you slept well because you're not aware of your own sleep patterns." She had just argued against my own experience of sleep. I was the one who slept in my body, but apparently she knew better than I did how rested I felt. At breakfast, I mentioned that my coffee tasted particularly good. "It's the same coffee we always have. You're probably just dehydrated, which makes everything taste stronger." She couldn't let me enjoy a cup of coffee without explaining why my enjoyment was based on a misunderstanding. That evening, our daughter showed us a drawing she had made at school. I said, "This is beautiful, sweetheart." Before our daughter could even respond, my wife jumped in. "The proportions are off and the colors are unrealistic. She needs to work on observational skills." I watched our daughter's face fall. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. She was extending this behavior to our child, teaching our daughter that positive expressions would be met with criticism and correction. That night, after our daughter went to bed, I decided to address this directly. "Why do you disagree with everything I say?" I asked. Her response was predictable. "I don't disagree with everything. You're being dramatic and oversensitive. This is exactly your problem. You can't handle different perspectives." Even my attempt to discuss the problem was being argued against. She was telling me that my perception of constant arguments was wrong, while simultaneously creating another argument. "Yesterday I said good morning, and you told me it was actually a mediocre morning," I pointed out. "I was being realistic. You always exaggerate everything. The morning was fine, not good. There's a difference." She was arguing about the difference between good and fine as if there were some objective standard for rating mornings that I had failed to meet. "I told you I love you, and you explained why love isn't real," I continued. "I was sharing scientific information. You get emotional about everything instead of thinking logically." She had turned my expression of love into evidence of my intellectual inferiority. The conversation continued for another hour, and she argued against every single point I made. She argued against my examples, my feelings, my observations, and my concerns. She even argued against my right to be bothered by constant arguing. By the end, I realized something that should have terrified her, but somehow didn't seem to register. She was completely incapable of agreeing with me about anything, including the fact that she disagreed with everything. The next few days, I paid attention to how she interacted with others. With her mother on the phone, she was agreeable and sweet. "You're absolutely right, Mom. That sounds like a great idea." With her best friend over coffee, she was supportive and encouraging. "I'm so proud of you for taking that job. You're going to do amazing." With the cashier at the grocery store, she was pleasant and courteous. "Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day." But the moment she turned to me, the switch flipped. "You picked the slowest line. We could have been out of here 10 minutes ago if you had looked at the other options." She was capable of normal, positive interaction. She chose not to have it with me. That night, I lay in bed thinking about what kind of person deliberately chooses to oppose their spouse's every word. What kind of person makes it their mission to ensure their partner can never express a thought without being corrected, contradicted, or criticized. I realized I was married to someone who had decided that my happiness, my confidence, and my peace of mind were threats that needed to be eliminated. Every time I expressed satisfaction with anything, she felt compelled to explain why I was wrong to feel satisfied. This wasn't marriage. This was psychological warfare disguised as conversation. The most devastating part was understanding that this was intentional. She wasn't doing this unconsciously or out of habit. She was making a deliberate choice every single day to turn every interaction we had into a battle. She had weaponized communication itself. The woman I married used to build me up. This woman had made it her full-time job to tear me down, one conversation at a time. That Thursday night, exactly 1 week after my revelation about our daughter's homework, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done trying to fix this. I was done analyzing it, understanding it, or working around it. I was done being the target of someone who had chosen to make me the enemy of every word I spoke. The time for conversation was over. The time for action had begun. I decided to conduct one final test. Not to prove anything to myself. I already knew what I was dealing with. This test was to confirm beyond any shadow of doubt that there was no conversation, no topic, no approach that wouldn't be turned into an argument. Friday evening, I came home with a plan. I would attempt the most basic positive interactions possible. If she could turn these into arguments, then there was absolutely no hope for normal communication in our marriage. During dinner, she had made pasta, and it actually tasted good. I looked at her and said, "Thank you for cooking tonight." Response: "I didn't cook for you. I cooked because we both need to eat. Don't make it sound like I'm doing you some special favor." Gratitude corrected. 2. When our daughter showed us her report card, straight A's across the board, I smiled and said, "Our daughter did amazing on her report card." Response: "It was an easy quarter. The teachers grade leniently in the fall. You're setting the bar too low by getting excited about expected performance." Pride in our child minimized right in front of her. 3. I mentioned that I had a productive day at work and felt good about what I accomplished. Response: define productive. You probably just did the minimum requirements and called it a success. That's your pattern, low standards for yourself. Professional satisfaction turned into evidence of inadequacy. 4. I tried something completely neutral. The news said it might rain tomorrow. Response: weather forecasts are wrong half the time. You shouldn't plan your day based on speculation. That's poor decision-making. Sharing a weather report became criticism of my planning abilities. 5. Finally, the most basic human interaction. How was your day? Response: why are you asking? You're just going to zone out while I answer like you always do. You don't actually care about my day. Showing interest became proof that I don't care. That's when I realized something that should have been obvious weeks ago. This wasn't about the topics we discussed. It wasn't about my communication style or word choices. This was about her fundamental decision that everything I said would be wrong, regardless of what it was. I could have read her the phone book, and she would have found fault with my pronunciation, my pace, or my choice to read it in the first place. I sat there looking at this woman I had been married to for years, and I felt like I was seeing her clearly for the first time. She wasn't my partner. She wasn't my companion. She had appointed herself my personal opposition, my full-time critic, my constant adversary. The final test came later that evening. I walked into the living room where she was watching television. "Good night," I said. "I'm going to bed." "It's only 9:30. You're going to bed too early, and then wonder why you wake up in the middle of the night." Poor sleep hygiene. She had just argued against my bedtime. I was a grown man, and my wife was correcting my decision about when to sleep. That night, lying in bed, I understood that I had been trying to solve a problem that wasn't actually a problem. It was a choice. She was choosing to oppose me. She was choosing to argue. She was choosing to turn every interaction into a conflict. This wasn't something that could be fixed with better communication, couples therapy, or more patience on my part. You can't fix someone's deliberate decision to be your enemy. I had spent months walking on eggshells, choosing my words carefully, trying different approaches, and attempting to find some magical combination of words that wouldn't result in an argument. But there was no combination of words that would work, because the problem wasn't what I was saying. The problem was that I was the one saying it. She had decided that my voice, my thoughts, my feelings, and my very presence were things to be opposed. I could have quoted her own words back to her, and she would have found a way to disagree with herself rather than agree with me. The woman sleeping next to me had turned our marriage into a competition where she won by making sure I always lost. Every conversation was a game where her victory required my defeat. That Saturday morning, I woke up and made a decision that would change both of our lives forever. I was done playing a game I could never win. I was done trying to communicate with someone who had made it clear that communication was impossible. I was done being married to someone who treated me like an enemy in my own home. Over the next week, I quietly began making arrangements, not because I was angry or emotional, but because I had finally accepted reality. This marriage was over. It had been over the moment she decided that everything I said would be wrong. She had turned every conversation into an argument, but she was about to discover that some conversations can't be argued away. The conversation that would end all our arguments was coming, and for the first time in months, I was going to have the last word. The following week was the quietest I had been in months, but not because I was avoiding conversation. I had simply accepted that conversation with my wife was impossible, so I stopped trying. This change didn't go unnoticed. Monday morning, as I quietly ate breakfast and read the news on my phone, she said, "You're being unusually quiet. Are you sulking about something?" Even my silence was being criticized. I looked up at her and simply said, "No." Then I went back to my phone. "That's not an answer. What's going on with you?" "Nothing's going on," I replied calmly. "Don't give me one-word answers. Talk to me." The irony was staggering. The woman who had spent months arguing against every word I said was now demanding that I say more words for her to argue against. But I was done playing that game. I had entered a new phase, strategic silence. Tuesday evening, she tried a different approach. "You've been distant lately. We need to talk about what's bothering you." "Nothing's bothering me," I said. And it was true. For the first time in months, I felt completely at peace because I had stopped expecting her to act like a reasonable person. "Something is obviously wrong. You're acting different." "I'm acting the same way I always act." "No, you're not. You're being cold and withdrawn." Even my emotional state was up for debate. She was trying to argue with me about my own feelings, telling me that my assessment of my own behavior was incorrect. Wednesday brought a new accusation. "You're punishing me with silence. This is passive-aggressive behavior." I almost laughed. Months of arguing against everything I said, and now my reduced talking was being framed as punishment. She had trained me not to speak by making every word a battle, and now she was upset about the natural consequence of her own behavior. Thursday, she escalated. "If you have something to say, just say it. Stop being a child about this." The woman who had turned good morning into an argument was calling me childish for saying less. The woman who had criticized my bedtime was accusing me of immaturity. But I remained calm and focused. I was using this week to prepare mentally for what was coming. I was rehearsing the conversation that would end all conversations. I thought through every possible response she might have. I anticipated her arguments, her deflections, her attempts to turn the discussion around on me. I prepared for the inevitable moment when she would try to argue against the divorce itself, because of course she would. She had argued against every other word I had ever spoken. Why would my decision to leave be any different? Friday evening, I made a realization that solidified my resolve. She hadn't asked me once during this entire week why I was quiet. She hadn't shown concern for my well-being or tried to understand what might be troubling me. Instead, she had criticized my silence, accused me of manipulation, and demanded that I return to providing her with words to argue against. Even her complaints about my quietness were complaints about me, not expressions of care for me. Over the weekend, I watched her interact with our daughter, and I saw glimpses of the woman I used to know. She was patient, encouraging, and supportive. She listened without immediately contradicting. She validated our daughter's feelings instead of explaining why those feelings were wrong. It confirmed what I already knew. She was capable of normal human interaction. She simply chose not to have normal human interaction with me. Sunday night, I sat in my chair and watched her across the room. She was on her phone, probably texting friends who got to experience the pleasant, agreeable version of her personality. I felt no anger, no resentment, no sadness. I felt relief. Relief that I had finally understood the situation clearly. Relief that I had stopped trying to fix something that was deliberately broken. Relief that I was about to end years of psychological warfare disguised as marriage. Monday morning came, and she made one final attempt to draw me back into her web of arguments. Your attitude this week has been unacceptable. We're going to sit down tonight and discuss this properly. I looked at her and said, okay. She seemed surprised by my agreement. She was probably expecting me to argue against her demand for a discussion, which would have given her the argument she was craving. But I wasn't going to argue against it. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for, a proper discussion. She just had no idea that this discussion would be unlike any other we had ever had. That evening, as I sat across from her at our kitchen table, I felt completely calm. I had spent months being reactive, defensive, and frustrated. Tonight, I was going to be strategic, clear, and final. For once, I was going to control the conversation instead of being controlled by it. She opened with her typical approach. I don't understand why you've been acting like this. It's immature and unfair to me. Even at the beginning of what she thought was going to be a reconciliation discussion, she was criticizing me and telling me my behavior was wrong. Perfect. She was about to give me the ideal opening for what I had to say. I looked her directly in the eyes and said, "You're absolutely right. We do need to talk." For the first time in months, I saw her look surprised. She had expected me to argue against her criticism. Instead, I had agreed with her. She had no idea that her weeks of training me to stay silent had actually given me the clarity and focus I needed to end this marriage with the impact it deserved. The final conversation was about to begin. I sat across from her at our kitchen table, completely calm for the first time in months. She had demanded this conversation, expecting another opportunity to argue with everything I said. She had no idea she was about to participate in the last argument of our marriage. "You're right," I began. "We absolutely need to talk. But this isn't going to be the kind of conversation you're expecting." She immediately shifted into her familiar defensive posture. "What's that supposed to mean? Are you going to blame me for your attitude this week?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm going to thank you." That caught her off guard. "Thank me for what?" "For showing me exactly who you are. For making it crystal clear that this marriage is over." Her face changed instantly. "What are you talking about? You're being dramatic again." "There it is," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Even me ending our marriage is something you need to argue against. You can't help yourself." "I'm not arguing. I'm trying to understand what's gotten into you." "What's gotten into me is clarity. For months, I've been trying to figure out how to communicate with you, how to avoid arguments, how to make conversations work. I finally realized I was trying to solve the wrong problem." She crossed her arms. "So now our communication problems are my fault?" "They're not communication problems. They're your deliberate choice to turn every single thing I say into an argument. You don't communicate with me, you oppose me. That's not true. You're exaggerating everything like you always do." I smiled. "Perfect example. I just told you that you argue with everything I say, and your immediate response was to argue with what I just said." She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, realizing she had walked directly into my point. "Let me save you some time," I continued. "I've already heard every argument you're about to make. You'll tell me I'm being too sensitive. You'll say you're just sharing different perspectives. You'll claim I can't handle disagreement. You'll blame my communication style, my attitude, or my expectations." Her eyes narrowed. "So now you're putting words in my mouth?" "No, I'm recognizing a pattern, the same pattern that turned good morning into a debate about whether the morning was actually good. The same pattern that turned I love you into a lecture about brain chemistry." She shifted uncomfortably. "Those were just conversations." "No, those were attacks disguised as conversations. You've spent months systematically opposing every word that comes out of my mouth. And I'm done pretending that's normal. Marriage takes work," she said, falling back on a cliché. "You can't just give up when things get difficult." I'm not giving up on difficulty. I'm walking away from someone who decided that everything I say would be wrong before I even said it. That's not marriage. That's psychological warfare. You're being ridiculous. I don't argue with everything. You're doing it right now. I tell you I'm leaving, and you're arguing against my decision to leave. You're literally proving my point while trying to disprove it. She stood up abruptly. You can't just end our marriage over conversations. I'm not ending it over conversations. I'm ending it over the complete absence of conversations. We haven't had a single peaceful exchange in months because you've made it impossible. That's not fair. You're making me sound like some kind of monster. You're not a monster. You're someone who decided that my happiness, my confidence, and my peace of mind were threats that needed to be eliminated. Every time I expressed satisfaction with anything, you felt compelled to explain why I was wrong to feel satisfied. She began pacing. You're twisting everything. I was trying to help you see things more clearly. By arguing against the color of the sky, by contradicting documented facts, by turning my love for you into a science lesson about chemical reactions, those were just different perspectives. No, those were deliberate attempts to make me doubt my own perceptions, feelings, and experiences. You turned our marriage into a constant battle where you won by making sure I always lost. She stopped pacing and looked at me with something that might have been panic. So what? You're just going to leave? Just like that? Just like that. Because this conversation we're having right now, this is our final conversation. After tonight, there will be no more arguments between us. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. And the beautiful irony is that even now, as I'm telling you our marriage is over, you're still arguing. You can't even let me leave peacefully. She sat back down. For a moment, I saw something in her eyes that might have been realization. We can work on this. We can go to counseling. Counseling requires two people who want to communicate. You've made it clear that you don't want to communicate. You want to dominate every conversation. I'm not interested in paying someone to watch you argue with a professional. But what about our daughter? What about our family? Our daughter will be better off seeing what healthy relationships look like instead of growing up thinking it's normal for parents to argue about everything. She's already starting to flinch when we interact. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This is all because I disagreed with you sometimes." I stood up slowly. This is because you turned every conversation into an argument for months. You made it impossible for me to express love, pride, happiness, or even basic observations without being corrected, contradicted, or criticized. But marriage means working through problems together. We never worked through anything together. You decided what the problems were, told me why I was wrong about everything, and expected me to accept constant correction as love. I walked toward the door, then turned back to face her. You know what the saddest part is? You're so addicted to arguing that you've argued yourself out of a marriage. You couldn't even let me leave without turning it into a debate. Where are you going? I'm going to pack my things. You can have the house, the arguments with yourself, and the victory of being right about everything, but you'll have them alone. This isn't over, she called after me. I paused at the doorway and smiled. Yes, it is. You can't argue with someone who's no longer listening. You spent months teaching me that every conversation with you would become an argument. Congratulations. You were right about that too. As I walked up the stairs to pack, I heard her calling my name, probably preparing another argument about why I shouldn't leave. But for the first time in months, I didn't stop to listen. I didn't engage. I didn't give her another opportunity to turn my words into weapons against me. The woman who had turned every conversation into an argument had finally run out of people willing to argue with her. And that silence, that beautiful, peaceful silence, was my first taste of freedom. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.